Women in uniform at the end of the day are only good for pouring drinks. You should get used to it. It's what you're built for. My future brother-in-law Julian smirked, spitting out every filthy word. Right next to him, my own mother Lexi shoved a stiff, cheap maid's apron hard against my chest, hissing, "You are not family, Amber. You are just a spare part. Put this on and get out there to serve the wine." My biological sister Alaya leaned against Julian's shoulder, raising a hand weighed down by a massive diamond ring to cover her giggles. In the eyes of these three, I was just a 42-year-old failure, a low-level desk clerk, pushing paper a stain that needed to be hidden away during this high-society wedding of the century. They gloated, bathing in their illusion of power, completely convinced they had crushed my dignity into the dirt. But they had absolutely no idea. The woman standing silently in front of them wearing faded jeans was actually Brigadier General Amber Walker. And the most terrifying lesson they were about to learn, I was the sole legal owner holding the deed to the luxurious mansion they were so proudly standing inside. I didn't shed a single tear. I just gave a cold smirk, locking my eyes straight onto Julian's smug face. He was puffing out his chest, bragging about his legendary 4-star general father. But this cowardly little man didn't know that in exactly 15 minutes, the powerful general he worshipped would personally deliver a slap so hard it would drop him right in the middle of the aisle. Shocking 300 VIP guests, all because he dared to insult me. But before that fated storm truly hit, this mental abuse had been carefully paved hours earlier, the very second I stepped back into the place I used to call home. The tires of the black SUV crunched over the gravel driveway. I cut the engine, sat in the silence. Outside the windshield, the McLean estate loomed like a freshly painted museum. Manicured lawns, stark white Roman columns, a multi-million-dollar shell trying to hide the rot inside. I pushed the door open. The biting Virginia wind hit my face. No welcome mat, just the cold stone. I grabbed my faded duffel bag, threw it over my shoulder, and walked up the steps. My scuffed boots made zero sound. Walk heavy, you die. Walk quiet, you survive. The brass lock clicked. I pushed the heavy oak door open. It hit me instantly. A sickening chemical wave of lemon wood polish mixed with the suffocating sweetness of white lilies. It smelled like a high-end funeral parlor. I stepped inside. The grand foyer was dead quiet. The marble floor sent a chill straight through the rubber soles of my boots. I stopped at the base of the winding staircase. My eyes went straight to the large wall above the mahogany console table. Empty. Well, not empty, but my life was gone. For 20 years, a framed photograph had hung right there. Me in my uniform standing shoulder to shoulder with my father on my graduation day. His proud, calloused hand gripping my shoulder. Now the expensive wallpaper in that exact rectangular spot was slightly lighter than the rest. Faded. Erased. In its place hung a massive gaudy oil painting, Lexi and Alaya. They sat on velvet chairs draped in silk, their necks heavy with glittering diamonds. Fake smiles, staring down at me from their canvas throne. No dad, no me. Just them. I didn't blink. I just stared at the lighter patch of wallpaper. 20 years of sweat, blood, and dirt wiped out by a decorator and a nail in the wall. You track mud on that rug, you are paying for the dry cleaning. The sharp clack of stiletto heels echoed off the marble. I didn't flinch. I turned slowly. My mother Lexi stood in the archway of the living room. She held a crystal glass of bourbon, her eyes cold and judgmental, dragged up and down my frame. From the scuffed toes of my boots up the knees of my faded jeans, stopping at the frayed shoulders of my sweater. Her mouth twisted in disgust. "I thought you were coming in through the back," she said. Her voice was light, airy, and entirely hollow. "It's my front door, Lexi," I said. "Keep it short." No emotion. She took a slow sip. "Not today, it isn't. The rehearsal dinner is tonight. We need things perfect. No distractions, no uncomfortable reminders of things that don't fit our aesthetic." She didn't ask how my drive was, didn't ask if I was tired. "Where is my room?" I asked. Lexi waved her free hand dismissively, the ice in her glass rattling. "Oh, that. We had to convert your old room into a bridal closet for Alaya. Julian bought her 3 gowns. They need climate control." She looked me dead in the eye, delivering the final cut. You can sleep in the attic storage. There's a cot. It doesn't have a heater, but you people are used to roughing it in the dirt anyway, right? She didn't wait for an answer. She turned her back, the stilettos clicking away toward the kitchen. Dismissed. I stood planted in the center of the cold marble foyer. My jaw clamped shut. I shoved my right hand deep into the pocket of my jacket. My calloused thumb found the heavy brass challenge coin. My dad's coin. The sharp grooved edges bit into my skin. I pressed harder. Breathe in. 4 seconds. Hold. 4 seconds. Exhale. My heart rate steadied. The anger settled, freezing over into something sharp and focused. I didn't say a word. I just adjusted the strap of my duffel bag, turned, and started the long, heavy walk up the dark stairs toward the attic. The air grew colder the higher I climbed, but my mind was entirely clear. Let them have their little illusion for a few more hours. The living room buzzed with the clinking of crystal and the low, arrogant hum of old money. Smooth jazz bled from hidden speakers. Julian stood with his arms crossed, a smug grin plastered across his face. He waited for me to bow my head. He waited for me to slip that cheap, stiff fabric over my neck and serve his draft-dodging friends. Alaya leaned into him, her diamond catching the chandelier light as she sneered. I didn't yell. I didn't defend myself. I just stood up straight. I rolled my shoulders back, letting my frame expand. My boots planted firm on the expensive rug. I locked my eyes onto Julian's face. I didn't blink. I just stared. It was the dead, hollow look of someone used to sizing up real danger in the dark. Julian's grin froze. The color drained from his cheeks. He shifted his weight. His crossed arms dropped to his sides. He took a half step backward, swallowing hard. The air seemed to leave his lungs. He couldn't hold eye contact. He broke first, looking down at his polished loafers. Lexi shoved the heavy silver tray toward me. It held 6 flutes of expensive champagne. The bubbles rose in perfect golden lines. Her facial muscles relaxed into a satisfied smirk. She thought she had won. She thought 20 years away from this house had broken me into a quiet, obedient ghost. I reached out. My calloused, scarred fingers gripped the cold, polished edges of the silver tray. Lexi let go. I didn't balance it. I didn't turn to serve it. I swung my arms down and slammed the heavy tray directly onto the solid oak coffee table. Crack! The deafening sound snapped through the room like a whip. Crystal flutes shattered into jagged pieces. Champagne violently splashed across the pristine white tablecloth, soaking into the fabric like a dark, spreading bruise. Shards of glass scattered across the polished wood. The jazz music played on, but the room went completely dead. Breathing stopped. Conversations choked in the throats of the elite guests. I looked down at my left hand. I was still holding the scratchy maid's apron between my thumb and index finger. The cheap polyester felt like sandpaper against my skin. I didn't look at my mother's shocked face. I turned and walked toward the stainless steel trash can in the far corner of the room. I held my hand over the rim. I let my fingers open. The apron fluttered down, landing dead on top of squeezed lemon rinds, crumpled lipstick-stained napkins, and wet coffee grounds. Right where it belonged. I pivoted on my heel. I snatched my faded jacket off the back of a velvet chair. I started toward the entryway. I didn't ask them to move. I just kept my heavy, measured pace. The crowd of men in tailored suits and women in silk dresses scrambled out of my way. They parted like cheap scarecrows in a gust of wind, pressing their backs against the walls. Not a single one of them opened their mouths to stop me. I reached the front door. My hand clamped around the heavy brass knob. I twisted it hard and yanked the door open. The biting Virginia wind hit my face, carrying the sharp scent of dry, dead leaves. I stepped out into the freezing night. I pulled the heavy oak door shut behind me. It slammed with a solid thud, instantly cutting off the jazz music, the smell of suffocating perfume, and the toxic rot of my own bloodline. I walked fast down the driveway. The gravel crunched loud under my boots. I yanked the door of my black SUV open and threw myself into the driver's seat. I shoved the key in and cranked the ignition. The engine roared to life, a deep mechanical growl against the unnatural silence of the affluent neighborhood. I threw the shifter into drive and slammed my foot on the gas pedal. The tires screeched, burning rubber against the cold asphalt. I twisted the steering wheel hard, pointing the headlights toward the dark highway. There was only one place left in this state that offered me any real silence. 4 in the morning. Arlington Cemetery was buried in thick, wet fog. The Virginia air was freezing, biting straight through my jacket. I walked the long rows of identical white marble headstones. No sound but the damp grass crunching under my boots. I stopped, stared down at the carved letters. Richard Walker. I dropped to one knee. The damp cold of the ground seeped through my jeans. I pressed my bare, calloused hand flat against the freezing marble. I closed my eyes. I just wanted to breathe. But the smell of wet earth started to twist. It turned sharp, acrid, burnt metal, scorched dirt. Kandahar. Christmas Eve. The memory hit me like a physical blow. The taste of grit in my teeth. The crust of dried blood cracking on my forehead. We had just been hit in the dark, badly. A kid named Miller was lying on a canvas stretcher 10 feet away, 19 years old. He had just stopped breathing. I was slumped against a concrete wall in the dark, my hands shaking so hard I could barely hold the heavy satellite phone. My ears were ringing. I punched in the numbers. I just needed to hear a familiar voice. I needed an anchor to keep from losing my mind. The screen lit up in my dirty palms. Lexi's face appeared, warm yellow light behind her. The faint, cheerful sound of jingle bells playing from expensive speakers. She held a glass of red wine. She didn't look at my face. She didn't look at the dirt or the exhaustion. She squinted at the screen, her mouth pulling down into a harsh frown. "Amber, you look absolutely filthy," she snapped. "I'm in the middle of hosting. Why are you calling right now?" Before I could force a word out of my dry throat, Alaya shoved her way into the frame. She bumped Lexi's shoulder, holding up a gleaming burnt orange leather purse. "Look," Alaya squealed, shaking the bag at the camera. "Hermes Julian just gave it to me early. Can you believe it?" I stared at the screen. 10 feet away from me, they were pulling a blanket over Miller's face. On the phone, my sister was screaming over a purse. Then, the siren started. It was a high shrieking wail that tore through the night sky. Incoming fire. The concrete wall behind my back started to vibrate. The phone in my hand shook violently. Lexi frowned, leaning away from the screen and covering one ear. "God, what is that awful noise?" Lexi groaned, rolling her eyes. "It's giving me a migraine. Look, we have to go. Alaya has a dress fitting in the morning." "Mom, wait." My voice cracked, dry, desperate. "Wash your face, Amber. You're ruining the holiday mood." Click. The screen went completely black. I was left alone in the dark, staring at my own dirty reflection in the glass while the ground shook beneath me. That was the exact moment I realized my family was dead. They didn't die in the dirt overseas. They died in a living room in Virginia, holding a glass of wine. I opened my eyes. The shrieking sirens faded. The quiet rustle of dead leaves blowing across the cemetery brought me back. My hand was still resting on my father's headstone. I pulled my hand back and reached into my pocket. My fingers wrapped around the heavy brass coin. I pulled it out and set it down hard on the top edge of the marble. Metal clicked sharply against stone. I stood up. I rolled my shoulders back and locked my knees. I raised my right hand, fingertips touching the edge of my brow in a slow, perfectly rigid salute. I held it there for 3 seconds, a promise to the only man in my bloodline who understood what it cost to stand up straight. I dropped my arm. I turned my back to the grave and walked toward my truck. The freezing wind didn't bother me anymore. It was time to bring the cold back to that mansion. 9 in the morning, the Four Seasons ballroom. The air was thick and heavy, choking on the smell of cut white roses and cheap hairspray. I stood in the far corner, my back pressed against a cold granite pillar. The shadows hid my faded jacket. I kept my arms crossed perfectly still, watching the circus unfold in the center of the room. Alaya was screaming. Her voice was a sharp, grating shriek that echoed off the high ceiling. She slammed a fistful of flowers onto a table, getting right in the face of a terrified young florist. "Are you blind?" I said, "Cream, not ivory. You are ruining my aesthetic." Julian stood right behind her. He puffed out his chest, jabbing his index finger into the shoulder of the hotel manager. "Do you have any idea who my father is?" Julian sneered, his face turning red. "He makes one phone call and you're sweeping streets tomorrow. Fix the lighting now." Pathetic. A grown man using his father's shadow to bully a guy in a cheap suit. The heavy glass doors at the front of the ballroom swung open. A tall, broad-shouldered man with iron gray hair walked in. General Arthur Hayes. He wasn't wearing a uniform, just a sharp charcoal suit, but the way he moved, measured, heavy, perfectly balanced, made the wealthy guest naturally step out of his way. Julian spotted him. "Dad! Tell this idiot how things work around." Hayes didn't even look at his son. He didn't break his stride. His sharp, hawk-like eyes swept the massive room, completely ignoring the white silk and the diamonds. His gaze snapped straight to the dark corner. He locked eyes with me. He stopped. I didn't move. He studied the way my weight was distributed evenly on the balls of my feet. He looked at the rigid line of my spine. His eyes narrowed, catching the faint, jagged white scar curving behind my right ear. He walked right past Julian. He left his son standing there with his mouth hanging open, the threat dying in his throat. Hayes stopped exactly 3 feet in front of me, the exact distance two people keep when they are used to sudden violent movements. He kept his voice low. It sounded like gravel and dry earth. "Helmand Valley, last winter. You're the one who pulled those kids out of the dirt. I'm not wrong, am I?" I didn't flinch. I uncrossed my arms and let my shoulders drop, squaring up to him. "Brigadier General Walker." I said, my voice flat. "It's an honor, sir." The muscle in Hayes's jaw twitched hard. He slowly turned his head to look back at Julian. His son was still throwing a tantrum, cursing at the manager over a spilled glass of water. Deep, sickening shame flashed across the older man's face. His eyes went dark. He connected the dots. He realized the low-class secretary his son had humiliated the night before was the same woman who had dragged his old friends out of a meat grinder a year ago. Hayes turned back to me. He extended a massive weathered right hand. I grabbed it. The grip was bone-crushing, solid. The rough calluses on his palm matched mine. "I don't let anyone disrespect what we do," Hayes said. Every word was clipped, biting through the air like a heavy blade. "Especially not a coward who shares my blood. Let me help you teach them a lesson." I didn't smile. I just gave a single, slow nod. Hayes let go of my hand. He turned on his heel and walked away, his heavy leather shoes echoing over the obnoxious jazz music playing in the background. I reached into my pocket and pulled out my phone. I didn't look at the screen. My thumb memorized the keypad, typing in a 12-digit encrypted number. I pressed it to my ear. The line clicked, ringing once in the dead silence of my mind. It was time to wake up Evelyn. Late afternoon. I pulled my truck into the dirt parking lot of a strip mall on the outskirts of the city. No sign on the door, just a frosted glass window. Evelyn Reed sat behind a desk buried under piles of loose paperwork and empty coffee cups. She didn't look up. She just pushed a tiny black plastic square across the scratched laminate surface. It was the size of a shirt button. "She is a manipulative old fox," Evelyn said, her voice dry, scraping like sandpaper. "Just sit there, let her talk. Arrogance digs its own grave." I picked up the plastic square. I slipped it under the collar of my shirt. The cold edge pressed hard against my collarbone. My heart rate stayed flat. An hour later, the air inside the expensive French restaurant was suffocating, heavy with the smell of roasted garlic, red wine, and Lexi's overpowering floral perfume. She was already sitting in the booth, pearls around her neck. A tight plastic smile glued to her face. She ordered the most expensive ribeye on the menu and immediately launched into a rehearsed speech about motherhood. She dragged out pale, half-forgotten childhood memories, trying to force a warm, nostalgic glow over the table. I didn't touch my food. I just watched her face. I watched the slight twitch at the corner of her mouth, the nervous, rapid blinking. She was chewing her steak, the silver fork scraping loudly against the white porcelain plate. The sound was grating, like fingernails on a chalkboard. Behind all this sugar, a knife was waiting. Dessert arrived. Lexi finally stopped chewing. She reached into her designer bag and pulled out a thick stack of stapled papers. She pushed it across the table. "I want to transfer the deed of the house," Lexi said, dropping her voice into a soft, coaxing purr. "It will be Alaya's wedding gift. Julian's family values equal assets. We need to look appropriate. I stared at the thick black letters at the top of the page. Unconditional forfeiture of inheritance. You just need to sign. Lexi continued, her painted nails tapping the paper. In return, I will give you a small lump sum. Enough for you to go back to wherever you live and stay out of the drama. You can finally have some peace. Peace. She wanted to buy my father's multi-million-dollar legacy with a pocket full of loose change, just so her golden child wouldn't look cheap in front of her rich in-laws. I raised my hand. I placed my calloused fingertips flat on the top page. I shoved the stack of papers hard. It slid across the smooth table, slamming right into her wine glass. No, I said, dry, empty. Lexi's smile froze. The fake warmth shattered. Her face twisted into a mask of pure, unhinged rage. Her voice cracked as she leaned over the table, spitting the words at me. You ungrateful, cold-blooded bitch, you never cared about this family. I didn't blink. I stood up, slowly pushing my chair back. I reached into my pocket, pulled out a crisp $100 bill, and dropped it onto the spilled papers. That house belonged to my father, I said, looking down at her. And now it belongs to me. I turned my back and walked toward the exit, leaving her screaming at an empty chair. Have you ever sat across a table from someone sharing your blood only to realize they were holding a knife behind their back? If you've ever had to protect yourself from your own family's greed, drop a yes in the comments right now. Like this video and subscribe to the channel if you know exactly what it feels like to finally say no and walk away. I pushed the heavy glass door open and stepped out into the freezing night air. I reached under my collar, pulled the tiny plastic button loose, and sent the audio file straight to Evelyn. My phone buzzed in my hand. The screen lit up with a text message from Alaya. I read the first line. They couldn't steal the house, so they had decided to steal the only thing I had left. My sanity. The harsh blue light from the phone screen illuminated the dark, empty living room of my short-term rental. I stared at the webpage. A blind item gossip blog. The headline was printed in bold, screaming black letters, "Jealous PTSD sister plotted to ruin influencer's high society wedding." Beneath the text was a photograph. It was a picture of me, not a recent one. It was a grainy shot taken 3 years ago, right after a 72-hour shift in the dirt. My face was pale, hollowed out from lack of sleep. My uniform was torn, my cheeks smeared with dried blood and thick brown mud. I looked exhausted. I looked like a ghost. The anonymous article twisted that reality into something filthy. It claimed I was unstable, dangerous, a mentally broken outcast trying to extort money from my wealthy family. They took the heaviest, most grueling sacrifice of my life and turned it into a cheap tabloid joke to protect Julian's fragile ego. My fingers went numb. The heavy smartphone slipped through my hand. Clack. The device hit the hardwood floor. I slumped forward on the cheap couch, burying my face in my rough hands. The silence in the dark room was deafening. My chest tightened, breath catching in my throat in short, uneven gasps. They didn't just want the house. They wanted to strip me naked in front of the world and burn my reputation to the ground. I squeezed my eyes shut. For a split second, I wanted to disappear. But then the quiet, steady voice of my father echoed in the back of my mind. The man in the arena. The one whose face is marred by dust and sweat and blood. I opened my eyes. The erratic thumping in my chest leveled out, slowing down to a slow, heavy mechanical rhythm. The pain evaporated. It was instantly replaced by something much colder. I leaned down and picked up the phone. I didn't open the blog again. I dialed a direct, secure 12-digit line. It rang twice. Sterling. A deep, gravelly voice answered. Sir, this is Walker, I said. My voice was completely flat, empty of any panic. I need the Helmand Valley action files fully declassified by 2 o'clock tomorrow afternoon. There was a heavy pause on the other end of the line, 2 seconds of complete silence. General Thomas Sterling didn't ask for a reason. He knew exactly what it meant when a request like that was made on this line. Understood, Brigadier General. Sterling's voice rumbled sharp and absolute. Show them the weight of what we do. I ended the call. I stood up and walked into the small bedroom. I stopped in front of the open closet. My hand reached up, gripping the zipper of a heavy black garment bag. I pulled it down. Inside hung my Class A dress blues. The dark midnight blue wool was perfectly spotless. I carried it over to the ironing board and plugged in the heavy iron. Hiss. Thick, scalding steam shot out from the metal plate. I pressed the iron down hard against the fabric, running it in slow, deliberate lines. The heat burned against my knuckles, but I didn't stop until every single crease was razor sharp. I lifted the heavy jacket. My calloused thumbs carefully picked up the small, heavy pieces of metal from a velvet box. Click, click. The sharp pins pierced the thick wool over my left breast pocket. The silver star. The purple heart. The metal was cold and unforgiving. Finally, I picked up the polished silver stars. I pressed one into each shoulder board. I put the jacket on and buttoned it up. I looked at myself in the full-length mirror. The woman looking back at me didn't look like a victim. She looked like a judge. I am not going to a wedding tomorrow. I am wearing my armor. 2:00 in the afternoon. The main ballroom of the Four Seasons was a masterpiece of fake perfection. White silk draped from the ceiling. Thousands of imported white roses choked the air with a heavy, sickeningly sweet smell. 300 guests, men in bespoke tuxedos and women dripping in diamonds, sat in velvet chairs, murmuring in low, polite tones. A string quartet played softly in the corner. Lexi sat in the front row, the mother of the bride. She sat completely rigid, her chin tilted up, bathing in the attention of the elite crowd. Up on the raised platform, Alaya stood in a custom diamond-crusted gown. She gripped Julian's arm. The minister tapped the microphone, the soft thump echoing through the speakers, preparing to read the vows. Everything was flawless. A perfect, expensive lie. Then the massive oak doors at the back of the ballroom blew open. Bang! The heavy wood slammed against the wall stops. The violent sound ripped through the room. The string quartet stopped playing instantly. A cello let out a harsh, screeching note before dying out. The murmuring stopped. Every head in the room snapped toward the entrance, faces twisting with annoyance at the interruption. But the annoyance didn't last. It evaporated, replaced by a suffocating, dead silence. I stepped into the room. I didn't say a word. I didn't look at the crowd. I was wearing my Class A dress blues. The thick midnight wool was immaculate. The heavy rows of medals pinned to my chest clicked softly with every step I took. The massive crystal chandeliers above no longer lit up the silk or the diamonds. The light caught the solid silver stars pinned to my shoulders, making them shine with a cold, blinding authority. Lexi's face went completely dead. The healthy pink flush drained from her cheeks, leaving her looking like a corpse in a designer dress. Her jaw dropped. Her carefully practiced smile shattered. Up on the platform, Alaya's grip on Julian's arm slipped. Her face turned chalk white. She tried to whisper something, but her voice failed. The heavy bouquet of white roses in her hands began to shake violently, petals fluttering down to the floor. I ignored them. I walked slowly down the center aisle. Clack, clack, clack. The sharp, heavy strike of my leather heels against the floorboards underneath the carpet sounded like a judge's gavel coming down. Each step carried the weight of 20 years. 20 years of being pushed into corners, locked in attics, and erased from picture frames. I didn't walk toward the altar. I stopped at an empty chair in the very last row. I turned, sat down, and crossed my legs. I kept my back perfectly straight. I folded my hands in my lap and stared straight ahead. A quiet, unmoving observer watching a train wreck about to happen. The heavy, authoritative silence I brought into the room completely crushed the fairy tale atmosphere. The illusion was dead. Julian felt it. He felt the attention of the wealthiest people in the city shift away from him. His fragile inherited ego couldn't handle the sudden irrelevance. His face flushed bright, angry red. The veins in his neck popped against his tight collar. He dropped Alaya's hand. He shoved his suit jacket back, exposing his chest. Julian stomped down the steps of the platform, his expensive loafers slapping hard against the floor. He marched straight down the aisle toward the back row. He was going to use his father's 4-star shadow to throw the mentally unstable secretary out of his wedding. He closed the distance fast. His hand reached out, fingers stretching to grab the fabric of my uniform. Before his skin even brushed my shoulder, a deafening roar shook the front of the room. Julian marched down the aisle, his face twisted in a red, arrogant sneer. His arm shot out, index finger pointing straight at my chest. He opened his mouth ready to unleash whatever entitled garbage he had prepared. He didn't get a single syllable out. A massive shadow stepped out from the front row. General Arthur Hayes moved with terrifying speed. He stepped right into his son's path. His broad shoulders completely blocked Julian from my view. Hayes planted his feet. He pulled his right arm back and swung hard. Smack! The heavy open-handed strike sounded like a gunshot, echoing off the expensive wood paneling. The sheer physical force of the blow threw Julian completely off balance. His polished loafers slipped on the carpet. He crumpled, crashing hard onto his side. He grabbed his jaw, a thin line of blood instantly pooling at the corner of his mouth. The 300 guests gasped. The sound of a collective sharp intake of breath sucked all the oxygen out of the ballroom. Hayes didn't even look down at his son. He didn't offer a hand. He just stepped right over him. The older man walked toward the back row. He stopped exactly 3 feet in front of my chair. He rolled his shoulders back, his chest expanding. His voice, deep and resonant, boomed through the dead quiet room. "Brigadier General Amber Walker," Hayes announced. He brought his right hand up in a sharp, perfect salute. I stood up slowly. I kept my face entirely blank. I brought my hand to my brow, returning the gesture. The click of my heels echoed loudly. Behind me, the massive projector screen meant for the wedding montage flickered to life. The gold-leafed A&J monogram vanished. Evelyn had done her job. A heavy, stark, white government document filled the enormous screen. At the top, stamped in bright red ink, was the word declassified. The text detailed every wound, every hour I spent pulling my people out of the dirt in Helmand. It laid bare the absolute truth, completely crushing the cheap anonymous tabloid lies my mother and sister had bought that morning. The screen blinked again. General Sterling's face appeared in a pre-recorded video. Any attempt to defame the character or sacrifice of Brigadier General Walker will be met with the full, unyielding weight of this department. Sterling's heavy voice rumbled from the high-end speakers. The room was paralyzed. Lexi gripped the velvet chair in front of her. She was hyperventilating, her chest heaving as she stared at the giant red stamp on the screen. Elia's hands trembled so violently that she dropped her custom bouquet. The white roses hit the floor, scattering around her feet. Then the final nail was driven in. Dozens of cell phones throughout the ballroom started buzzing at the exact same time. The journalists and society bloggers in the crowd pulled their phones from their pockets. Evelyn had mass emailed the audio file. The crystal-clear recording of Lexi trying to blackmail me into giving up my father's house played from a dozen different screens. Julian scrambled to his knees on the carpet. "Dad!" He choked out, spitting blood. "Dad, help me!" Hayes looked down at him. Absolute disgust burned in his eyes. "You are completely cut off, Julian." Hayes said, his voice cold enough to freeze water. "I am stripping your inheritance. You are no longer my son." Nobody clapped. Nobody cheered for the bride and groom. Instead, the men and women in the expensive suits and dresses began to stand up, one by one. In absolute, terrified silence, they turned their backs on the altar and looked toward me. I didn't smile. I didn't say thank you. I just looked at the wreckage of my mother's carefully constructed empire. I stood there looking at the people who tried to destroy me, watching them lose everything in 3 minutes. Have you ever watched karma finally catch up to the people who treated you like garbage? Hit the like button and subscribe. If you believe the truth always wins. Drop the word karma in the comments right now if you know exactly how satisfying this moment feels. I uncrossed my hands. I turned my back on the silent room, pushed the heavy oak doors open, and walked out into the cold afternoon air. The illusion was dead. Now it was time to handle the cleanup. The fallout was fast, brutal, and completely absolute. By 9 the next morning, Julian was permanently locked out of his corner office at the investment firm. His father had made one phone call to the board of directors. The wedding of the year was canceled. The catering trucks packed up their rotting shrimp and drove away. By noon, Elia's carefully curated social media empire collapsed. 3 major fashion brands dropped her sponsorships, citing a strict zero-tolerance policy for defaming veterans. By evening, Lexi's name was quietly scrubbed from the board of directors of 3 prominent Washington charities. The elite society friends she had spent 20 years kissing up to stopped answering her calls. Their entire fake, glittering world burned to ash in under 24 hours. 3 days later, the intercom buzzer in my short-term apartment screamed. I set my mug of black coffee down on the kitchen island. I walked over to the security monitor mounted on the drywall. Lexi and Aliyah were standing outside the lobby doors. The high society masks were completely gone. Lexi's expensive blowout was flattened by the cold rain. Her makeup was smudged dark mascara running down her cheeks. Aliyah was leaning against the brick wall, crying hysterically into a damp tissue. They looked pathetic. Two drowning women looking for a raft. Lexi jabbed the buzzer again. She leaned close to the camera, her voice cracking through the cheap intercom speaker. Amber, please. Lexi sobbed, her voice raw and desperate. You have to call the papers. You have to tell them it was a misunderstanding. We are losing everything. Please, you're my daughter. I stood in the perfectly quiet, sterile apartment. The smell of bitter coffee filled the air. I didn't feel an ounce of pity. I didn't feel anything at all. I reached out and pressed the mute button on the intercom. The crying cut off instantly. The silence in the room was heavy, thick, and incredibly peaceful. I pulled my phone from my pocket, opened their contact files, and tapped block caller. The real killing blow didn't come from me. It came through the certified mail. My attorney delivered a thick legal envelope to the McLean mansion. It wasn't an eviction notice. Eviction would have been too easy. They would have just played the victim on social media. Instead, it was a heavily bound rental agreement. If Lexi and Aliyah wanted to keep living in my father's house, they had to sign it. The terms were non-negotiable. Starting on the 1st of the month, they were required to pay rent at the absolute highest luxury market rate in the county. It was a staggering, suffocating number. A number guaranteed to bleed their remaining savings dry dollar by dollar, month by month. They weren't being thrown out on the street. They were being locked inside a very expensive, very heavy cage. But the final clause of the contract was the real knife twist. Every single cent of their monthly rent check was legally mandated to be deposited directly into the Colonel Richard Walker Memorial Fund for Fallen Families. Every 30 days, the women who had mocked my uniform, the women who had complained about the noise of artillery fire while my people bled in the dirt, would have to sit at their mahogany table and write a massive check to support the exact same people they despised. They would be funding my father's legacy until they were broke. I walked over to the small coffee table. I picked up the heavy brass coin. I wiped a smudge of dust off the grooved metal with my thumb and dropped it into my canvas duffel bag. I pulled the heavy brass zipper shut. I walked over to the window and looked out at the glowing streetlights of the Capitol. That house was just a tomb for their greed now. As for me, I finally had to start living the rest of my father's life. 6 months later. The auditorium was freezing. I stood behind the heavy oak podium. 1,000 cadets sat in front of me dressed in crisp gray wool. They sat perfectly straight, dead silent. I didn't talk about guns. I didn't talk about surviving in the dirt. I gripped the edges of the wood, leaning into the microphone. Sometimes the hardest fight isn't out there, I said. My voice echoed off the high stone walls. Sometimes true courage is standing up, looking at the people who share your blood, and drawing a hard steel line. You protect your integrity even if it means leaving them behind in the dark. No one moved. The silence in the room was heavy, built on absolute respect. Later that night, the rain beat lightly against the glass of my Washington, D.C. apartment. I sat at the kitchen counter. The hum of the refrigerator was the only sound. I opened my laptop. The screen cast a sharp blue light across the dark countertop. There was an email waiting in my inbox. The sender was the manager of my father's memorial fund. Attached was a short video file. I clicked play. A girl appeared on the screen, 18 years old. She was sitting on the edge of a cheap, sagging mattress in a cramped dorm room. Her name was Sarah. Her father didn't make it back from overseas. She looked directly into the camera lens. Her eyes were red, her face wet. It wasn't the fake, manipulative crying I grew up watching my mother perfect. These were heavy tears of pure, exhausting relief. I don't know who you are, Sarah choked out. She wiped her face with the frayed sleeve of her sweatshirt. But you paid my tuition. You kept me out of debt. You gave me a chance when everyone else just gave me pity. Thank you. I thought about Alaya screaming over a burnt orange designer purse while good people died in the sand. Then I looked at Sarah crying with gratitude over a chance to read textbooks and build a quiet life. I reached out and hit the spacebar. The video paused on her smiling, tear-stained face. I leaned back in the hard wooden chair. The edges of the dark room started to blur. A heavy, hot tear slipped down my face, tracking over the rough, scarred skin of my cheek. I didn't wipe it away. For 20 years, I carried the weight of my family's disgust. I carried the anger of being erased from my own home. But right now, in this quiet kitchen, that anger was completely gone. Miles away in Virginia, Lexi and Alaya were sitting in that cold, silent mansion. Every single month, Lexi had to pick up her expensive gold pen and write a massive rent check. She hated it. But every single dollar she bled into that fund was building a future for a kid like Sarah. My father's real legacy wasn't a piece of real estate. It wasn't the marble floor or the crystal chandeliers. It was sitting right here, breathing, living, and smiling on my laptop screen. The justice was perfect. I looked down at the heavy brass coin resting next to the keyboard. I picked it up. The metal was warm, the grooved edges familiar against my thumb. I set it down, opened a new blank document, and placed my hands on the keys. The cursor blinked steadily. A quiet, patient rhythm. The plastic keys clicked sharply under my calloused fingertips. Each letter felt like laying down a brick for a new foundation. I started typing. I didn't write this story to brag. I wrote it for anyone sitting in a dark room feeling like they are going crazy because their own family is tearing them apart for greed. I wrote this to tell you to stand up. You are not alone. The truth in the very end is the absolute heaviest weapon you have. Use it. Thank you so much for listening to my story. If you found strength in these words, please leave a comment, like this video, and subscribe to the channel. Remember, you hold the pen to your own life. Goodbye, and stay strong.